In the glittering halls of Buckingham Palace, tension simmered beneath chandeliers and crystal. The Emir of Qatar arrived with sharp demands, his guarded stance threatening to overshadow diplomacy. Yet, in one unplanned moment, a single gesture from Catherine, Princess of Wales, shifted the entire evening. What began as cool formality turned into warmth and unexpected praise. This is the story of how one move changed not just a banquet, but the future of royal diplomacy. Tension before the banquet. In the final week of September 2025, the British Foreign Office worked overtime. The state visit of the Emir of Qatar, scheduled for October 1st at 7 p.m., not just ceremonial, it carried weighty demands. For nearly 3 weeks, officials debated investment deals worth billions of pounds, energy contracts tied to 20-year supply terms, and concessions on technology partnerships. By the time the Emir's plane touched down at Heathrow, pressure was already mounting inside Buckingham Palace. Diplomatic teams rehearsed endlessly. On September 28, 2025, at 2:30 p.m., Palace aides held their fourth seating rehearsal in the Grand Ballroom. Each position at the banquet table was carefully calculated. Charles beside the Emir, Catherine near a Qatari minister, William across from Sheikha Jawahir. Behind the velvet curtains, whispers circled about how one wrong seating arrangement could be interpreted as disrespect. Every detail mattered, down to the flowers selected from Windsor Gardens, cut just 12 hours before the event. Princess Catherine, 43 years old, prepared differently. She studied Qatari customs late into the night, learning 7 Arabic phrases that could be spoken with authenticity. She asked aides for cultural notes, such as the importance of hand gestures and colors. On September 30th at 10 p.m., William reportedly found her reading over notes about Qatari traditions. Her decision to embed symbolism in her gown design, patterns inspired by desert motifs, was deliberate. Catherine's role was not to negotiate terms, but to soften edges. By the morning of October 1st, the stakes were clear. King Charles III, now 76 years old, was eager to prove his reign strong after just 2 years on the throne. The Emir, arriving with expectations tied to energy contracts and investments, carried leverage Britain needed. Diplomats worried that firm demands could overshadow goodwill. In this tense atmosphere, Catherine's influence was quietly recognized. She was not the negotiator in official terms, but she was the emotional bridge the monarchy relied upon. As carriages rolled toward Buckingham Palace on the evening of October 1st, 2025, tension hung like mist. Diplomats whispered of contracts, aides checked their notes, and cameras clicked furiously. But for all the preparation, no one could predict how the night would unfold. The Emir carried expectations, the king carried formality, and William carried duty. Yet it would be Catherine, quietly, gracefully, who carried something far more powerful. Her presence would alter the tone of the evening in ways no one foresaw. Entrance and atmosphere. At 7:05 p.m., the grand doors of Buckingham Palace swung open. Guards in scarlet uniforms saluted sharply, and chandeliers blazed across the marble halls. Carriages stopped in precise intervals of 3 minutes each, delivering dignitaries and ministers. Then came the Emir of Qatar, tall and composed in his traditional attire, with Sheikha Jawahir by his side. Cameras captured every step as King Charles welcomed them. The air shifted again when William and Catherine appeared, descending the staircase together. Catherine's presence drew immediate attention. At 7:10 p.m., as the royal couple approached the ballroom, photographers captured over 200 flashes in 60 seconds. Her gown, ivory silk embroidered with desert-inspired motifs, signaled both elegance and respect. Guests noted her posture, upright yet relaxed, her smile gentle yet commanding. For the Emir's delegation, used to grand gestures of power, Catherine's warmth stood out. Even in a room filled with ambassadors and ministers, her quiet charisma set the tone. The grand ballroom itself radiated formality. Tables stretched more than 48 feet, lined with crystal goblets and Wedgwood porcelain. Over 1,200 candles flickered above, casting light across white roses imported from Windsor Gardens. At the head table, Charles sat across from the Emir, with Catherine strategically placed near a Qatari minister. Around them, more than 150 guests filled the chamber: cabinet ministers, cultural leaders, and business executives. Beneath the glittering chandeliers, tension lingered in silence, waiting for the evening to unfold. As Catherine took her seat at 7:20 p.m., eyes subtly followed her. Diplomats, trained to read body language, noted how her gestures, leaning forward, smiling, nodding, projected openness. The Emir, arms crossed at first, watched with measured curiosity. Advisors whispered about energy contracts, but Catherine's influence was quieter, operating beneath the surface. For now, the evening remained tense, but already her presence promised to play a greater role than anyone had scripted. The palace glittered, but beneath the crystal and gold, unease remained. The Emir's guarded demeanor hinted at demands to come, while diplomats braced for speeches that could spark friction. Catherine's quiet composure seemed to hold the atmosphere together, a thread preventing unraveling. Yet the night had only just begun. In the coming moments, the tension would sharpen, and the first real tests of diplomacy would arrive. It was here, between protocol and persuasion, that Catherine's role would truly be revealed. Early exchanges. By 7:40 p.m., as the first course was served, conversation began cautiously. King Charles III opened with remarks about cultural ties, referencing a 1979 state visit to Qatar and the 50 years of cooperation since. The Emir nodded, polite but restrained, his words measured. Around the table, British ministers engaged in light exchanges about weather, art, and sports. Catherine, seated between a Qatari minister and a British cultural ambassador, listened intently, smiling at intervals to ease the formality. The Emir's posture revealed guardedness. He leaned back, arms folded, speaking only when addressed directly. His team of 5 advisors, seated nearby, whispered into notepads and tapped on phones, relaying observations. At 7:55 p.m., he made his first pointed remark, mentioning energy partnerships needing fair returns. Diplomats stiffened, recognizing this as a veiled reminder of his demands. Yet Catherine, attentive, shifted her focus, not to policy, but to people. She recognized that trust had to precede negotiation. Catherine turned to Sheikha Jawahar at 8:05 p.m., complimenting her jewelry, a gold brooch said to date back 60 years to her grandmother. The Sheikha's smile brightened, and conversation flowed into family traditions. Catherine then shared an anecdote about Prince George's school project on world cultures, drawing laughter from those nearby. These exchanges were not scripted, yet they cut tension. Where Charles and the Emir dealt in contracts, Catherine dealt in human connection, her subtle art bridging gaps silently. By 8:20 p.m., the mood around Catherine's end of the table softened noticeably. The Emir, though still guarded, glanced more often toward her side. Advisors whispered that she was creating an emotional corridor in the room. Eye contact, nods, and pauses became tools in her diplomacy. For now, nothing had shifted in policy, but the room's energy was no longer cold. Catherine was building a foundation. It would be this groundwork that allowed her later gesture to change everything. As dinner moved toward its midpoint, tension simmered just below the surface. King Charles prepared to speak, the Emir ready to respond, and diplomats braced for policy-heavy exchanges. Yet something intangible had already begun shifting. Catherine's attentive listening and small gestures had warmed the space in ways no speech could achieve. The stage was set for conflict and for resolution. What came next would define not just the evening, but the future image of the monarchy itself. Rising friction in speeches. By 8:30 p.m., the string quartet faded into silence, and King Charles III rose to deliver his speech. He began warmly, addressing the Emir directly and weaving in 3 Arabic phrases he had practiced. His words praised 50 years of UK-Qatar relations, referencing a 1974 trade accord and the shared role in 2012's London Olympics. Applause followed, but seasoned diplomats knew the harder part was next. The Emir, known for precision in language, rarely let such occasions pass without reminders of his expectations. At 8:45 p.m., the Emir delivered his response. He began with gratitude, but soon his tone shifted. He spoke of balanced partnerships, then paused deliberately before mentioning energy contracts spanning 20 years. His reference to fair returns for all parties drew subtle glances among British ministers. By the time he mentioned £25 billion investments, tension at the table had thickened. The Emir's body leaned forward, voice steady, making clear that beneath courtesy, his demands were firm. British diplomats stiffened. Notes scribbled at 8:48 p.m. showed worry over the Emir's phrasing, which implied conditions unfavorable to the UK. At least 12 aides exchanged nervous glances. Advisors from the Foreign Office recalled similar tension in 2013, when an Emirati delegation walked out of talks over cultural misunderstandings. Here in Buckingham Palace, history seemed poised to repeat. A misstep could derail negotiations, leaving the banquet remembered not for unity, but division. All eyes shifted to Catherine, though she had not spoken yet. Catherine, seated quietly near the head table, sensed the room tightening. Her gaze followed the Emir as he emphasized mutual respect, though his tone carried sharper meaning. At 8:50 p.m., she leaned slightly forward, signaling attentiveness. William glanced at her, catching the same undercurrent. The moment hung precariously. Speeches had raised expectations, but goodwill risked slipping. Catherine waited, holding her silence, preparing to act. She knew timing would matter more than any word she could say. The speeches had set the stage, but not for comfort. King Charles had built a bridge, the Emir had placed conditions, and advisors were left uneasy. For a moment, the banquet felt less like celebration and more like negotiation under crystal chandeliers. Yet Catherine, watching carefully, sensed the tide could still turn. What would follow was not written in policy notes, nor rehearsed in diplomatic briefings. It would hinge on instinct, on humanity, and on a gesture no one anticipated. The critical gesture. The moment came at 9:05 p.m., during a lull as dessert was served, pistachio mousse with rosewater. Conversation thinned and silence deepened. Catherine leaned slightly toward Sheikha Jawahar, her hands resting lightly on the table. Then, without ceremony, she reached across and touched the Sheikha's hand gently. The touch lasted just 3 seconds, but it carried weight beyond measure. It was not formal like a handshake. It was personal, empathetic, disarming. The air shifted instantly. The gesture was quiet, but it carried cultural resonance. In Qatari tradition, as Catherine had studied in notes dated September 27, 2025, hand gestures convey sincerity more than words. The Sheikha's smile broadened, her shoulders relaxed. Across the table, the Emir noticed. His gaze met Catherine's directly at 9:07 p.m. Her eyes were steady, her expression calm. This was not performance. It was connection. The subtle signal spoke louder than any prepared line about friendship or partnership. Diplomats noticed immediately. At least 6 aides stopped mid-note, startled by the sudden change in atmosphere. Where tension had held the air tight, warmth now spread. The Emir blinked, his posture shifting forward. In that instant, formality cracked. Even ministers whispered, "Did you see that?" Later accounts noted it was Catherine's most unplanned act of the night, born not from strategy, but from empathy. And yet, it achieved what 2 hours of speeches had failed to accomplish. By 9:10 p.m., silence gave way to subtle laughter around Catherine's table. The Emir raised his glass, not toward Charles, but toward Catherine. His words, translated into English, were simple. "To her grace." It was not flattery of royalty, but admiration of character. The heavy demands he had carried into the palace seemed to soften. Conversations resumed, this time less guarded. Catherine's single move had changed the trajectory of the banquet. Diplomacy had shifted from rigidity to openness in one gesture. The touch had lasted only moments, but its effect rippled across the hall. Where tension had dominated, warmth began to spread. Advisors, once rigid, leaned back in relief. Ministers exchanged hopeful glances. Even the Emir's team, once intent on pressing demands, adjusted their notes. The banquet was no longer a test of wills, it was becoming a dialogue. Catherine had shown that diplomacy need not always be negotiated in contracts. Sometimes it could be rewritten with humanity in a single gesture. The Emir's reaction. At 9:15 p.m., the Emir's demeanor transformed. Where his arms had once been crossed, they now rested openly on the table. He leaned in toward Catherine's side, smiling more readily. His voice, once firm and guarded, softened. In Arabic, he addressed his ministers with a note of admiration. This is how trust is built. His team, 5 men in dark suits, nodded quietly. The stern mask he had carried since arriving in London seemed to dissolve. Raising his glass again at 9:18 p.m., the Emir praised Catherine directly. "It is not protocol I respect, but sincerity," he said in English. The comment was brief, but it struck the room like a chord. Ministers who had prepared for disputes scribbled new notes. Tone softened, demands easing. British diplomats, accustomed to tense negotiations dragging for months, realized the tide had shifted in less than 15 minutes. The banquet, once strained, was now filled with cautious optimism. Paragraph 3. Observers noted the Emir's conversation afterward changed direction. Instead of repeating numbers, £25 billion, 20 years, 50% concessions, he began asking Catherine about her children. She shared a brief anecdote about Prince George's school project, and the Emir laughed, nodding in approval. His earlier focus on hard terms gave way to dialogue about cultural exchange, education, and shared family values. For diplomats, it was astonishing. Catherine had turned negotiations away from ledger books and toward human bonds. By 9:30 p.m., the Emir's softened stance was unmistakable. He no longer pressed his earlier demands, instead framing them as opportunities for balance. Advisors who had braced for conflict eased into smiles. William, seated nearby, reached under the table and gently squeezed Catherine's hand, signaling pride. King Charles, though outwardly composed, allowed himself a brief smile of relief. The shift was real. The night's hardest moment had been overcome not by speeches, but by Catherine's quiet instinct. The Amir's transformation reshaped the banquet. No longer adversarial, the atmosphere flowed with warmth. Where policy had threatened to dominate, connection had won instead. Diplomats whispered of a turning point, recognizing the evening as something historic. Catherine's gesture, though fleeting, had become the heart of the story. And as conversation lightened across the long tables, one truth was clear. The banquet would be remembered not for what was negotiated, but for how one woman's grace changed everything. Transformation at the table. By 9:40 p.m., the atmosphere in the grand ballroom had shifted so dramatically that aides whispered of two different evenings. Where the first half had been filled with stiff postures and guarded phrases, the second flowed with ease. Conversations expanded beyond oil and finance, moving into culture and shared history. The Amir asked Catherine about Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, laughing warmly at her anecdotes. His guarded posture from earlier at 8:30 p.m. was now gone. British ministers noticed the change. At 9:45 p.m., Foreign Secretary James Cleverly quietly leaned toward an aide and said, "This is no longer negotiation. It's storytelling." The Amir asked about Catherine's charity work, especially her projects since 2011 on children's mental health. Catherine responded with details of her early initiative, comparing it to Qatar's own youth programs launched in 2017. Suddenly, topics of balance sheets and percentages gave way to shared commitments. Advisors exchanged astonished glances. Photographers captured the moment. At least 50 images showed the Amir gesturing animatedly toward Catherine, his face more expressive than in any earlier photographs. These visuals, time-stamped between 9:40 to 10 p.m., contrasted starkly with the stiff body language seen at 7:55 p.m. Diplomats later remarked that the press images alone told the story of the evening's transformation. The Amir appeared not as an adversary pressing terms, but as a partner engaged in meaningful dialogue. By the time the main banquet concluded at 10:10 p.m., advisors were scribbling in margins. Tone softened, momentum favorable, continue follow-up. It was clear the change had not been engineered by policy documents, but by Catherine's presence. She had recentered the evening around humanity. For those present, the realization was profound. The most pivotal diplomatic move of the night had not come from Charles, ministers, or contracts. It had come from a single touch across a polished table. The banquet was no longer a battlefield of numbers, but a dialogue of shared values. What had begun with tension ended with smiles and warmth. Catherine's instinct had transformed not only the Amir's mood, but the entire tone of the event. As the formal meal gave way to closing ceremonies, it was clear the story would not end in that ballroom. Its ripples would reach into headlines, broadcasts, and diplomatic briefings, where her gesture would be replayed and magnified worldwide. Afterglow and media ripples. By 10:30 p.m., as the banquet transitioned into the receiving line, observers noted a striking change. The Amir, who had entered Buckingham Palace at 7:05 p.m. with firm demands, now greeted Catherine with visible warmth. He lingered in conversation for 3 minutes, thanking her for her sincerity. Cameras caught his smile as he praised her grace under pressure. The British press, with over 120 reporters accredited for the event, immediately picked up on the subtle shift. The first leaks emerged within 2 hours. At 12:45 a.m. on October 2nd, the BBC's midnight broadcast reported, "Diplomatic tension diffused by Princess of Wales." By morning, newspapers carried headlines such as "The touch that changed the room" and "How Catherine calmed the Emir." International outlets followed. CNN credited Catherine's soft power diplomacy, while France's Le Monde wrote that her gesture carried symbolism equal to strategy. Across 4 continents, the moment became front-page news. Royal insiders confirmed to journalists that Catherine had prepared for weeks, studying Qatari customs since September 20th, 2025. But they also emphasized the spontaneity of the gesture. "No script could have ordered it," one aide said. The tension before dessert had threatened to undo 3 months of preparation. Instead, it ended with admiration. The palace press office, releasing a statement at 11 a.m., framed it carefully. Her Royal Highness embodied the values of sincerity and partnership. Social media amplified the story further. By October 2nd at 6 p.m., hashtags like Royal Grace and Catherine Diplomacy had generated more than 3.2 million posts across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Clips of the Emir raising his glass to Catherine circulated endlessly, often paired with music or captions celebrating her composure. In less than 24 hours, the banquet shifted from a potential diplomatic crisis into a case study of successful royal diplomacy, anchored by a single human moment. The banquet ended, but its afterglow only grew stronger. The Emir's softened stance carried into headlines, and Catherine's gesture became the centerpiece of every report. For the monarchy, this was more than an evening of hospitality. It was proof that influence could flow from grace as much as from power. Yet beyond the praise and headlines, deeper implications loomed. If one gesture could reshape a tense negotiation, what did it mean for Catherine's role in the monarchy's future? Personal and institutional impact. Inside palace walls on October 3, 2025, aides reflected on what had happened. The Emir's softened tone was a diplomatic victory, but Catherine's role was larger. Her single gesture now symbolized an alternative form of influence: empathy over coercion, connection over calculation. For William and Catherine, aged 43, it marked a turning point. They were no longer only heirs. They were actors shaping outcomes. Institutions that once overlooked Catherine's role in foreign affairs began reassessing her as a bridge builder. At the Foreign Office, reports compiled on October 4th described Catherine's impact in pragmatic terms. De-escalation achieved. Demands reframed. Favorable tone. Ministers noted that it had saved potentially £10 billion in strained negotiations. One diplomat, who had served since 1998, called it the clearest case of royal soft power in 20 years. The monarchy's relevance, often debated in modern politics, suddenly appeared undeniable. Catherine had demonstrated that even without a vote or office, her presence carried tangible influence. For the monarchy's image, the banquet was transformative. In recent years, scandals, Harry's exit in 2020, Prince Andrew's fallout in 2019, had eroded confidence. Polls from 2023 showed only 55% of Britons supported the monarchy's long-term future. But within 48 hours of the banquet, new surveys showed a 12-point rise in approval, with 67% citing William and Catherine as reasons to maintain faith. To the public, Catherine embodied not just elegance, but emotional intelligence the crown needed. Within the family, the event reinforced William and Catherine's partnership. At 11:30 p.m. after the banquet, William privately told aides he was prouder than ever. Catherine, though deflecting praise, reflected quietly that the gesture reminded her of holding her children's hands through storms. The symbolism was deeply personal, yet in the eyes of the nation, it was institutional. A monarchy often criticized as rigid had, in one moment, looked warm and human again. The banquet had left an imprint that extended beyond headlines. It reshaped Catherine's role, boosted William's image, and restored confidence in an institution under scrutiny. Diplomats studied it as a lesson, the press hailed it as a turning point, and the public embraced it as proof the crown could still adapt. But the story was not only about a single night. It was about legacy, the way one gesture would be remembered as part of Catherine's enduring mark on royal diplomacy. Legacy of a single move. By October 5, 2025, commentators were calling it the banquet touch. Analysts compared it to Queen Elizabeth II's early visits in the 1950s, which reshaped Britain's image after empire. Others linked it to Diana's embrace of AIDS patients in 1987, remembered as a defining moment of compassion. For Catherine, age 43, this single gesture had entered the same lineage of symbolic acts. It was no longer just a banquet story. It had become part of royal history. Academics suggested the moment would be studied as a case of soft power diplomacy. At King's College London, professors on October 6th noted it could influence training programs for diplomats, showing how emotional intelligence shifts outcomes. Already, think tanks cited the evening as an example of relational strategy. The monarchy, often dismissed as ceremonial, had demonstrated practical influence. Catherine's move would likely appear in future analyses of the 2020s Britain, alongside Brexit negotiations and post-pandemic recovery. For William and Catherine, the legacy is personal. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, will grow up hearing of the night Mama calmed a banquet. It will form part of their family's story, much as Diana's compassion shaped theirs. But beyond family, it marks a shift in strategy. Royal influence no longer rests solely on speeches or ceremony. It thrives in moments of authenticity. Catherine's legacy now carries that truth. One gesture can alter the perception of an entire institution. In the broader arc of monarchy, the banquet of October 1st, 2025, will endure as a symbol of renewal. Where power once came from hierarchy, it now flows from humanity. For Catherine, this moment anchors her legacy not only as consort, but as a stateswoman in her own right. For William, it reinforced their partnership. And for the monarchy itself, it proved survival lies not in rigid crowns, but in gestures that bridge worlds. One move, one night, endless resonance. The banquet had begun under tension, carried the weight of demands, and risked failure. Yet, by its close, it was remembered for something else entirely. Catherine's single gesture rewrote the atmosphere, softened a hardened leader, and strengthened the crown's image. Historians may one day record treaties and trade deals, but people will remember the moment of humanity. In that hall of crystal and gold, diplomacy was redefined, not by contracts, but by connection. One move changed everything.